something happened across the developed world between 2020 and 2024, and you have felt all of it without once seeing it happen. Your money bought less every year while the number in your account never fell. Real wages in Japan went backwards for 26 consecutive months, the longest run ever recorded there. British pension funds came within days of collapse in a single week in September of 2022. And in 4 of the largest economies on Earth, the assets you would need to own in order to get out of the way of any of this ran further out of reach at exactly the same time. Nobody announced it. There was no vote, no tax, no transaction, no day on which it occurred. Economists have had a name for the mechanism since 1973, and you will never hear a central banker say it out loud. All of it traces back to a relationship between 2 numbers that fits in a single sentence. Tonight, we go and find it. Through a hotel in New Hampshire in the summer of 1944, through an Irish banker pulled headless from his own burnt house in London, through a Saturday evening in Washington in 1979 that put 12 million Americans out of work, and into a Japanese savings account opened in 1972. Get comfortable. Stay with it to the end, because you will see exactly how the largest debt in history was repaid without ever being repaid, and who covered it. Ad-free versions live over on our Patreon, Meridian Labs, which this channel is part of alongside a few others, with early access and an audio-only feed for listening with the screen off. Subscribe or join if you haven't. Let's start where it started. There is a working paper sitting on the International Monetary Fund's servers, published in January of 2024, and it contains a number that should have ended a story that every economics textbook still tells. The story goes like this. After the Second World War, the United States owed more money than it had ever owed in its history. Federal debt held by the public stood at 106% of gross domestic product in 1946. 28 years later, in 1974, that figure was 23%. The debt did not default. There was no restructuring, no haircut, no negotiation with creditors, no moment where the United States government announced it could not pay. The bonds were honoured, every one of them, and the mountain simply went away. The explanation you have been given for this, in every classroom and every policy debate and every op-ed about the modern deficit, is that America grew out of its debt. Post-war boom. Suburbs, highways, television sets, the baby boom, the greatest expansion of industrial output in human history. The economy got so much bigger that the debt shrank next to it, the way a large object shrinks when you walk away from it. Clean, reassuring, and it implies something comforting about the present, which is that if we can just get growth back, the current pile of debt takes care of itself the same way. Durham Acklin and Lawrence Ball ran that claim through a counterfactual. Ball is a macroeconomist at Johns Hopkins. Their paper is titled, with a directness that economists do not usually permit themselves, "Did the US really grow out of its World War II debt?" They rebuilt the period without the 2 distortions they identified, holding the government's actual tax and spending behaviour constant. What they found is that if the United States had genuinely just grown out of it, if growth alone had done the work, debt would have fallen from 106% to 74% of gross domestic product by 1974. Not 23, 74, which means 51 percentage points of the largest debt reduction in the history of the developed world came from somewhere other than growth. Their decomposition splits it. 17 points came from primary surpluses, which is the honest part, the part where the government actually taxed people and paid the money back. 6 points came from interaction effects. And 28 points, more than half of the entire unexplained gap, came from what they call interest rate distortions. 28% of the entire American economy transferred over 3 decades through a mechanism that has no name in public life. I want to be precise about what that phrase means, because it is doing an enormous amount of work and it is deliberately bloodless. An interest rate distortion, in this context, means that the people who lent money to the United States government were paid back in dollars worth less than the dollars they lent, and the interest they received did not come close to covering the difference. They were repaid in full, in nominal terms, exactly as promised. And they lost, systematically, year after year, for most of 3 decades, without a single default, without a single missed payment, and without anything ever appearing on a statement that would tell them it was happening. That money did not evaporate. Debt does not evaporate. Every dollar that came off the government's balance sheet came off somebody else's. It came out of savings accounts, and pension funds, and insurance reserves, and the war bonds that people had bought out of patriotism and kept in drawers. It came out of the accounts of people who checked their balance and saw a number that had not gone down, and who therefore had no idea that anything had been taken from them at all. And here is the part that I have not been able to put down since I started reading about this. When you go looking for the person who decided to do that, when you try to find the meeting, the memo, the vote, the signature at the bottom of the page authorizing the largest peacetime transfer of wealth in the history of the industrialized world, there is nobody there. That is what this is about, not the transfer. The transfer is documented, quantified, published in peer-reviewed journals, and in the working papers of the institutions that manage the global financial system, and it is not seriously in dispute among the economists who study it. What is in dispute, or rather what has never been properly asked in public, is who is holding the other end of it. Because a transfer requires a recipient. Money that leaves one account arrives in another, and every time you follow the trail of this particular mechanism toward the person or the institution, or the committee that receives the benefit and made the choice, the trail thins out, and forks, and eventually stops in a room that turns out to be empty. Economists do have a name for this. They have had one since 1973. The name is financial repression, and the reason you have never heard a central banker say it out loud in a press conference is one of the more revealing facts in modern economic history, and we will get to exactly why. But the name itself tells you something before we go anywhere near the history. It was not invented to describe what rich countries do, it was invented to describe what poor ones do, and it was invented as an accusation. Start with the arithmetic, because the arithmetic is the whole thing and it is embarrassingly simple. Anyone who tells you this is complicated is either confused or is counting on you being intimidated. You have money in a bank. The bank pays you interest. Call that the nominal rate, the number printed on the statement. At the same time, prices are rising, which economists measure as inflation. Subtract the second number from the first, and you get the real interest rate, which is the only number that describes what is actually happening to you. If your bank pays 2% and prices rise by 1%, your real rate is positive 1%, and you have gained. If your bank pays 2% and prices rise by 6%, your real rate is negative 4%, and you have lost 4% of everything you own, and the statement will show you a larger number than last year while it happens. That is the entire mechanism. There is nothing else to it. Hold the nominal rate below the inflation rate, keep it there, and wealth flows from anyone who is owed money to anyone who owes money. Automatically, continuously, without a transaction, without a tax form, without a vote, and without any individual anywhere in the system having to do anything except allow it to continue. And the largest debtor in every one of these countries, by an enormous margin, is the government. The reason this matters more than any individual policy argument you have ever had is that the transfer functions as the most reliable debt repayment technology ever discovered. Nobody in the literature treats it as an accident of bad forecasting. There is a body of academic literature quantifying exactly how well it works, and the numbers in that literature are large enough that when you first read them, you assume you have misread a decimal point. The definitive study is by Carmen Reinhart and Maria Belen Sproncia. Reinhart is at Harvard and was chief economist at the World Bank. The paper is called The Liquidation of Government Debt. It first appeared as National Bureau of Economic Research, working paper number 16,893 in March of 2011, then as Bank for International Settlements working paper 363, then as an International Monetary Fund working paper in 2015, and finally in the journal Economic Policy. I list all four because the paper's institutional pedigree matters here. This is not a pamphlet. This is the establishment describing its own machinery. Reinhart and Sproncia went through the period from 1945 to 1980 and measured, country by country and year by year, how much government debt was liquidated by negative real interest rates. Liquidated is their word. For the United States and the United Kingdom, the answer was between 3 and 4% of gross domestic product every year for 35 years. For Australia and Italy, where inflation ran higher, the figure was closer to 5% per annum. 3 to 4% of everything a country produces, moving in one direction annually for a generation. To give that a shape you can hold, 3.5% of American gross domestic product today would be somewhere north of $1 trillion a year. Every year. For 35 years. Coming off the government's obligations and out of the accounts of everyone who had lent to it, which in the 1950s and 60s meant an enormous number of ordinary households. Because ordinary households were where the savings were, and because, as we will see, they had been carefully arranged so that they had nowhere else to put them. Now hold on to that number, because there is a second finding in the same literature that is somehow stranger. Ignazio Visco, who was at the Bank of Italy and later became its governor, put it plainly at a Bank for International Settlements conference in Lucerne in June of 2011. Real ex-post interest rates in the advanced economies were negative in about half of the years of the financial repression era, compared to less than 15% of the time since the early 1980s. Half, for 35 years, in the wealthiest and most stable countries on earth, in the period we now teach as the golden age of the industrial middle class, holding money in a bank or a government bond was a losing proposition roughly every other year, by design, as a matter of policy. You were not told this. I do not mean it was hidden. I mean something more specific and more difficult to accept, which is that it was published continuously in the open literature, discussed at conferences, quantified by the research departments of central banks, and simply never translated into the language of public life. There was never a moment where anyone had to decide to conceal it, because there was never a moment where anyone was required to announce it. That distinction is going to matter enormously by the end of this, because the obvious reaction, the one I had, the one you are probably having, is to look for the villain. Somebody built this. Somebody profits. And that instinct is correct in one direction and completely wrong in another. And the gap between those two things is the actual story. The transfer is real. The arithmetic is not in question. The beneficiaries are identifiable in aggregate, and the losers are identifiable in aggregate, and the aggregate numbers are enormous. Therefore, there must be a decision somewhere. But when Reinhart and Sproncia describe the mechanism, they do not describe a plan. They describe a set of policies, adopted separately, in different countries, for different stated reasons, over a period of years, most of them justified on grounds that had nothing to do with debt at all. Interest rate ceilings introduced to stop banks competing themselves into failure. Reserve requirements introduced for prudential safety. Capital controls introduced to protect exchange rates. Pension regulations requiring institutions to hold safe assets, meaning government paper, introduced to protect retirees. Every one of those policies has a defensible public rationale. Every one of them was argued for in good faith by serious people, and when you stack them together, they form a machine whose function is to make it impossible for savers to escape a negative real interest rate. Nobody had to design it as a machine. It assembled itself out of individually reasonable parts. And that is the first thing I want you to hold, because it is going to come back at the end, and it is going to be considerably worse than it sounds right now. When I say there is nobody in the room, I do not mean the room is hidden. I mean the room does not exist. The machine has no author. And a machine with no author cannot be switched off by removing anyone from office, cannot be voted out, cannot be held responsible, and, most importantly, does not need to be reinvented. It rederives itself. Whenever the conditions return, it comes back on its own, assembled out of the same reasonable parts by people who have never heard of Carmen Reinhart and who believe, correctly, that each individual decision they are making is defensible. The conditions returned in 2020. But before any of that can land properly, you need to understand where money enters an economy. Not how much of it there is, where it goes in. Because the entire question of who wins and who loses in this system was answered with brutal clarity nearly 300 years ago by an Irish banker who made a fortune being upstream of exactly this mechanism, who wrote the book explaining precisely why what he had done amounted to theft, and who was then found in the smoking ruins of his own house in London with his head missing. His name was Richard Cantillon. He was born in County Kerry in Ireland, sometime in the 1680s, into a Catholic family of the kind that had been on the wrong side of every English decision for a century. He ended up in Paris, and in 1719 and 1720 he was standing next to the largest financial mania that Europe had produced up to that point. The mania was John Law's. Law was a Scottish gambler and convicted murderer who had escaped from an English prison and talked his way into becoming, effectively, the finance minister of France. His idea was not stupid. France was crushed by debt from the wars of Louis XIV, and Law proposed to fix it by consolidating the debt into shares of a company holding the trading rights to French Louisiana, and by issuing paper money through a national bank to buy those shares. Money creation and debt conversion running on the same engine. The shares went from around 500 livres to over 10,000 in under 2 years. Half of Paris tried to get in. The word millionaire was coined during this period, in French, to describe the people who came out of it rich. Cantillon was one of them. He ran a bank in Paris. He lent money to speculators so they could buy shares. He took the shares as collateral, and when the price went vertical he sold, and got out and moved his money abroad before the collapse. When the collapse came in 1720, the shares went to essentially nothing. The paper money became worthless. France was left with a distrust of banking so deep that it did not establish a proper central bank for another 80 years, and Richard Cantillon was one of the richest private individuals in Europe. He was sued for the rest of his life. Some of the people who had borrowed from him and been ruined argued in court that he had knowingly lent them money to buy an asset he was simultaneously dumping. The litigation followed him from Paris to Brussels to Utrecht to London. He was arrested at least once, and at some point in the middle of all that, in around 1730, he sat down and wrote a book explaining with total clarity exactly what he had done and why it worked. The book is called Essai sur la nature du commerce en général, an essay on the nature of commerce in general. It was not published in his lifetime. It circulated in manuscript, was finally printed in 1755, 21 years after his death, and William Stanley Jevons later called it the cradle of political economy. Which is a strange thing to say about a book written by a man who was, by the standards of any era, a profiteer describing his own method. Here is the argument. Everyone before Cantillon, and a great many economists since, thought about money creation as a change in a quantity. More money in the system means each unit is worth less, so prices rise and everyone's money loses value at roughly the same rate, and therefore nothing much has really happened except a change in the units. It is the economic equivalent of relabelling every price tag in the shop. Annoying, but not a transfer. Cantillon said that is wrong, and it is wrong for a reason that is almost embarrassingly obvious once someone points it out. Money does not arrive everywhere at once. It arrives somewhere first. He used a gold mine. Suppose a new mine opens in a country. The gold does not appear evenly in every purse. It appears in the hands of the mine owner, and then the miners he employs, and the merchants who supply the mine. Those people are suddenly holding more money, and they go out and spend it, and crucially they spend it at the prices that existed before anyone knew about the mine. They buy meat and wine and cloth at the old prices. Their spending is what bids the prices up. Then the butchers and vintners and drapers have more money, and they spend it, and the wave moves outward, and prices rise in a sequence, in an order, radiating from the point where the money entered. By the time the wave reaches a schoolteacher in a village 200 miles away, the prices of everything she buys have already risen. Her income has not. It will, eventually, maybe, partially, but she has spent the entire intervening period buying at the new prices with the old salary. She has been taxed. Nobody taxed her. There was no law, no rate, no assessment, no collector. But the purchasing power that left her went somewhere, and it went to the people who were standing next to the mine. This is the Cantillon effect, and it is one of those ideas that once you see it, you cannot look at monetary policy the same way again. The important variable was never the quantity created. What matters is where it enters. Distance from the insertion point determines whether you are a net winner or a net loser, and distance has nothing to do with how hard you work or how much value you produce. Proximity is the only variable. Cantillon knew this because he had been standing directly on top of the insertion point in Paris in 1719 with his hands out. Now in a country in the 1720s, the insertion point was a mine or a mint or John Law's printing press. The question for us, obviously, is where the insertion point is now. And here is where I need to stop and correct something, because the popular version of this argument is wrong in a way that gets the whole thing dismissed by anyone who knows how the plumbing works. The version you will hear on the internet is that central banks print money, the money goes to rich people buy assets, asset prices go up, you cannot afford a house. Money printer, in the crude formulation. And the reason that version fails is that quantitative easing, the policy usually being described, does not create money in anyone's bank account. Here is what actually happens. A central bank buys government bonds and a small number of other assets on the open market. It does not buy them from you. It buys them from a specific tiny set of institutions, which in the United States are called primary dealers, and which number around 24. The central bank pays for those bonds by crediting the seller's reserve account, and reserves are a special kind of money that exists only inside the banking system and cannot leave it. A reserve balance cannot buy a house. It cannot buy groceries. It can only be lent to another bank or held. So the transaction is a swap. The financial system had bonds. Now it has reserves. The total quantity of assets held by the private sector has not changed. What has changed is the composition, and specifically the amount of safe, interest-bearing, long-dated assets available for anyone to hold has fallen, because the central bank has taken them off the market and is sitting on them. That is the actual mechanism, and nobody looking at it closely would call it a money printer. What it does is remove the safe place to put money. And here is why that matters for Cantillon. If you are a pension fund, or an insurance company, or a person who wants to retire, you need a return. You used to get it from government bonds. The central bank has now bought so many government bonds that the yield on the remaining ones has been crushed to near zero, or below. You cannot meet your obligations at that yield. Therefore you move into corporate bonds, into equities, into property, into anything that still produces a return. And so does every other institution facing the same problem at the same time. Trillions of dollars of capital go looking for yield simultaneously, and the price of everything they buy goes up. The Bank of England said this out loud, in public, in an official publication, and almost nobody noticed. In the quarterly bulletin for the third quarter of 2012, published on the 12th of July that year, a team consisting of Venetia Bell, Michael Joyce, Joshi Liu and Chris Young published a paper titled The Distributional Effects of Asset Purchases. It is the bank's own assessment of who benefited from its own policy, and their assessment was that the asset purchases had pushed up the price of equities by at least as much as they had pushed up the price of gilts. Then, in the same document, they noted the following. Financial asset holdings are heavily skewed, with the top 5% of households holding 40% of these assets. The Central Bank of the United Kingdom published, in its own bulletin, a document confirming that its principal crisis policy had raised the value of a class of assets 40% of which is owned by 5% of the population. And there was no scandal, there was no front page, there was no resignation. There was a quarterly bulletin. I want to be scrupulously fair here, because the same document contains the counter-argument, and the counter-argument is not weak. The bank also stated that without its asset purchases, most people in the United Kingdom would have been worse off. Unemployment higher. More firms failed, more households in default, and that is almost certainly true. Josh Bivens at the Economic Policy Institute in the United States has made the parallel argument at length, that the employment effects of these policies were progressive and disproportionately helped people at the bottom of the income distribution, and that focusing only on the asset price channel gives you a distorted picture. Ben Bernanke has defended the policy on the same grounds. There is work by Klaus Adam and Panagiota Tsamarani finding that the net effect on wealth inequality is genuinely ambiguous, because house prices are much more evenly distributed across the population than shares are, and rising house prices help the middle far more than rising equity prices do. Those are real arguments, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. If someone tells you the distributional effect of quantitative easing is settled and obvious, they have not read the literature. But notice what none of those arguments dispute. None of them dispute Cantillon. None of them dispute that the money entered at a specific point, that the people at that point transacted first at the old prices, and that the wave propagated outward through a sequence. The argument is entirely about whether the compensating benefits at the far end of the wave were large enough to offset the losses. It is an argument about the size of the transfer, not about whether a transfer occurred. And there is a second thing none of them dispute, which is the thing that actually matters for where this is going. In 2020, the mechanism was not only quantitative easing, it was fiscal. Governments sent money directly to households, in the United States as direct payments, in Britain and across Europe as wage support schemes that paid a percentage of the salaries of people who were not working. That money went straight into the real economy, into the accounts of people who spent it on goods. At a moment when the supply of goods was constrained by closed factories and jammed ports, that is the part that moved consumer prices, not the reserves, the transfers. Which means the honest version of the 2020 story is not that a central bank printed money and made rich people richer. The honest version is that two different insertion points were opened at the same time. One at the top of the financial system, which lifted asset prices, one directly into household accounts, which lifted consumer prices, and a person who owned no assets and whose wages did not keep up with consumer prices was downstream of both. That is worse than the crude version. Not better. The crude version has a villain with a printer. This version has two policies, both defensible, both argued for on humanitarian grounds, both supported across the political spectrum, whose combined effect was to raise the price of everything you need to buy, and the price of everything you would need to own in order to escape, simultaneously, while the number in your account stayed exactly where it was. There is one more thing about the modern insertion point that I think deserves saying plainly, because when people imagine a hidden financial elite, they usually imagine something concealed, and the actual arrangement is the opposite of concealed and considerably stranger for it. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York publishes a list of the institutions it will transact with in open market operations. They are called primary dealers. There are roughly 24 of them. The list is on the website. It has been on the website for years. Anyone can read it, and almost nobody does, and there is no reason anyone should, because the arrangement is entirely mundane. A central bank needs counterparties that can absorb enormous volumes reliably, so it maintains a vetted list, and the firms on it accept obligations in exchange, including an obligation to bid at every Treasury auction. There is no cabal anywhere in that. It is plumbing, and the people who work at those firms are, in the overwhelming majority, doing an ordinary job. But it is also, precisely and unambiguously, the insertion point. Every dollar the Federal Reserve creates through asset purchases enters the financial system through one of those 24 balance sheets. No allegation is required to establish that. The operational design is published, explained, and defended in the Fed's own documentation. Cantillon's argument does not require anybody at the insertion point to be doing anything wrong. That is what makes it so difficult to argue against, and so difficult to get angry about in any useful direction. The gold from the mine did not benefit the mine owner because he was wicked. It benefited him because he was there. The mechanism runs on proximity, and proximity is not a crime. And you cannot legislate against being early. And there is a layer beneath even that one, which took me longer to see than it should have. The dealers are not really upstream. They are the first outlet. Upstream of them is the entity that issued the paper in the first place, which is the government, which is also the entity that owes the debt being liquidated, which is also the entity whose appointed central bank sets the interest rate that determines whether the liquidation happens. And it is also, in every one of these countries, the entity whose statistical agency defines the price index against which the real interest rate is calculated. I want to be scrupulous here because this is exactly the point at which this kind of argument usually goes off the rails into something unserious. National statistical agencies in developed countries are professionally independent, staffed by career statisticians, and subject to methodological review. The choices that go into a consumer price index, how to handle quality improvements in goods, how to treat the cost of owner-occupied housing, whether to use a fixed basket or one that adjusts as consumers substitute between goods, are genuinely difficult technical problems with genuine technical literatures behind them, and the people making those choices are not taking instructions from a finance ministry. I have seen no credible evidence otherwise, and I am not suggesting any. But notice the structure anyway, because the structure does not care about the integrity of the individuals inside it. The party that owes the money also sets the rate paid on it, also defines the index that determines whether that rate is real or negative, and also faces no requirement to ever publish the resulting transfer as a number. Not one of those four things is improper on its own. There are good reasons for each of them. Together they describe a debtor who administers the terms of its own repayment and is under no obligation to report the outcome. That is not a conspiracy. It is worse than a conspiracy, because a conspiracy can be exposed. Cantillon understood the structure of this in 1730. He also understood, because he had lived it, that being upstream is never earned. Nobody arrives there because they deserve to. They arrive because of where they happen to be standing. He died in London in May of 1734. His house on Albemarle Street burned to the ground in the night, and a body was recovered from the ruins, badly burned. And according to several contemporary accounts, Headless, a cook he had recently dismissed, a man named Joseph Denier, was tried for the murder and acquitted. The post-mortem reportedly suggested that the death had occurred before the fire started. And then there is the other possibility. His biographer, the economist Antoine Murphy of Trinity College Dublin, published a study of Cantillon in 1986 in which he raised a hypothesis that is difficult to shake once you have heard it. Murphy noted that a man calling himself the Chevalier de Lavigny arrived in Suriname shortly afterward carrying documents that had belonged to Cantillon, and argued that Cantillon, buried under litigation from the people he had ruined, may have staged his own death and burned an unidentified body in his own house in order to disappear. There is a grave in the old churchyard at St. Pancras in London that says otherwise. Historians disagree. Nobody knows. I find it appropriate, in a way I am slightly uncomfortable with, that the man who explained that the winners in a monetary expansion are simply the people who were standing closest to the source ended his own life as an open question, with no confirmed body, no confirmed motive, and no one ever held responsible. Because that pattern is about to repeat at a scale several orders of magnitude larger. Cantillon described the insertion point. He did not describe what happens when the entity standing at the insertion point is also the largest debtor in the country, and also the entity that sets the interest rate, and also the entity that writes the rules about where everyone else is allowed to put their money. That combination did not exist in 1730. It was assembled between 1942 and 1951 in Washington, in a fight between the Treasury and the Federal Reserve that almost nobody outside the profession has heard of, and which ended with a man being removed from his job for trying to stop it. In April of 1940, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the Treasury of the United States asked the Federal Reserve to do something that no central bank in a major economy had ever formally agreed to do, and the Federal Reserve said yes. The request was for a peg. The Treasury needed to borrow an amount of money that had no historical precedent, roughly the entire pre-war economy, in order to build an army and a navy and an air force and eventually a nuclear weapon, and it needed to borrow that money cheaply, because at the scale of borrowing involved the interest bill alone could become unpayable. So the Federal Reserve committed to holding the yield on short-term Treasury bills at 0.3%, and to holding the yield on long-term Treasury bonds at 2.5%, and it committed to doing this by buying whatever quantity of government debt was necessary to keep those numbers where they were. Understand what that means operationally. The Federal Reserve gave up control of its own balance sheet. It no longer decided how many bonds to buy. The market decided, by selling to it. Anyone holding a government bond who wanted to sell at the pegged price could sell, because the central bank was standing there as an unlimited buyer. The Federal Reserve had become, in the phrase that later circulated inside the institution, an engine of inflation with no brake. Nobody objected much at the time, and I do not think anybody should have. There was a war. The alternative to cheap war finance was expensive war finance, and expensive war finance in 1942 might well have meant a different outcome in 1945. If you are looking for the moment where someone made a bad decision, it is not this one. The problem is what happened when the war ended. The peg did not end when the war did. It continued. Wartime price controls came off in 1946, and the prices that had been held down by government order for 4 years went where they had been trying to go the whole time. Between June of 1946 and June of 1947, consumer price inflation in the United States ran at 17.6%. The following year, June of 1947 to June of 1948, it ran at 9.5%. Barry Eichengreen has calculated that inflation averaged more than 7% a year across the period from 1947 to 1951. And the Federal Reserve was still legally and institutionally committed to holding the interest rate on government bonds at 2.5%. Do the subtraction. 17.6 minus 2.5. A person holding a United States Treasury bond in that year lost roughly 15% of their purchasing power in 12 months in the safest asset in the world, on a security they had been told was a patriotic duty to hold, while the government that issued it maintained a policy specifically designed to prevent the interest rate from rising to compensate them. Now put a person in that sentence, because the abstraction hides what this is. Between 1941 and 1945, something like 85 million Americans bought war bonds. The Series E bond was the retail instrument, sold in denominations starting at $18.75, which returned $25 at maturity in 10 years. School children bought stamps to fill books to trade for them. Payroll deduction schemes at factories signed up entire workforces. There were bond rallies with film stars. Every one of those purchases was an act of trust in an institution, made by people who in most cases had no other savings and no other financial assets of any kind. A person who bought a Series E bond in 1944 and held it to maturity in 1954 received the promised nominal return. And, in real terms, after the inflation of 1946 and 1947 and the Korean War spike in 1951, a substantial portion of what they had lent was simply gone. Not stolen, not defaulted on, repaid, in full, in dollars that no longer did what the dollars they had handed over could do. They were told they were funding the war. They were. They were also, unknowingly, funding the repayment of it. At least one person inside the system understood exactly what was happening, and said so repeatedly in writing to the President of the United States and the Secretary of the Treasury, and it cost him his job. Marriner Eccles was a Utah banker, a Mormon, the son of a Scottish immigrant who had arrived in America with almost nothing and built an industrial fortune. Eccles took over the family businesses when his father died, and during the Depression did something almost unheard of among bankers of his class, which was to conclude from direct observation that the standard prescription of balanced budgets and wage cuts was making the collapse worse. He arrived at a rough version of Keynesian fiscal policy independently before he had read Keynes. From watching his own banks and his own depositors, Roosevelt appointed him to the Federal Reserve Board in 1934, and he was the principal architect of the Banking Act of 1935, which restructured the Federal Reserve into roughly the institution it is today. The building where the Board of Governors sits in Washington is named after him. Eccles supported the wartime peg. He helped implement it, and from 1945 onward he argued, with increasing bluntness, that continuing it in peacetime was an act of institutional self-destruction, that the Federal Reserve had been reduced to an arm of the Treasury, and that the inevitable result was that the cost of the government's debt would be paid by the people who held it. Whether or not anyone admitted that was the policy, in 1948, President Truman declined to reappoint him as chairman, and Eccles did something that people in his position essentially never do. He did not resign. His term as a governor still had years to run, and he stayed in the seat, demoted, on the same board he used to run, and kept fighting the peg from inside. For 3 more years. The fight ran through the Korean War, which began in June of 1950 and produced another inflation surge, and it came to a head in a series of confrontations between the Federal Reserve, Treasury Secretary John Snyder, and Truman himself. Truman's position was straightforward and, in its own terms, honourable. He had personally sold war bonds. He believed that allowing bond prices to fall would be a betrayal of the people who had bought them. What he did not appear to grasp, or did not choose to say, is that the policy he was defending in order to protect bondholders was the precise mechanism by which bondholders were being drained. The confrontation ended on the 4th of March, 1951, with a statement of about 100 words issued jointly by the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, saying that the two institutions had reached full accord on debt management and monetary policies. That is the entire text of the most consequential change in American monetary institutions in the 20th century. It is called the Treasury-Fed Accord, and it freed the Federal Reserve to set interest rates independently. At the moment it was signed, the long bond rate stood at 2.47%. Chairman Thomas McCabe resigned within weeks. His replacement was William McChesney Martin, the Treasury official who had negotiated the accord from the Treasury side, a choice which the Treasury presumably understood as installing their own man, and which turned out to be one of the great miscalculations in institutional history, because Martin ran the Federal Reserve for 19 years as a fierce defender of exactly the independence he had been sent to contain. So the peg ended. The Federal Reserve was freed. Eccles had been right, and the institution he had rebuilt had won its independence back, and he retired from the board in July of that same year, having stayed exactly long enough to see it. Here is the part that took me a long time to properly absorb. The debt kept melting. The peg ended in 1951. American federal debt was still above 70% of gross domestic product, and it continued falling year after year through the 1950s and the 1960s and into the 1970s, all the way down to 23% in 1974, 23 years after the mechanism that supposedly caused it had been formally dismantled. Which means the peg was not the mechanism. The peg was an unusually visible, unusually explicit, unusually well-documented instance of the mechanism. It was the version with a signature on it. When it ended, what ended was the signature. The subtraction continued. And this is the point at which the story stops being about a policy and starts being about something considerably harder to look at directly. Because if the peg was not the cause, then something else was holding interest rates below inflation for another 2 decades without anyone having to agree to do it. Something structural. Something that did not require a chairman, or a president, or an accord, or a fight. What Reinhart and Sprancia found, when they went looking for that something, is that it was not one thing. It was a set of about 6 of them, and they had been assembled between 1933 and 1947, mostly for reasons that had nothing to do with debt, and their combined function was to ensure that a saver in the United States, or the United Kingdom, or France, or Italy, or Japan had, in practical terms, nowhere else to put their money. Not no good option, no option. You cannot lose money to a negative real interest rate if you can move your money somewhere the rate is positive. The entire mechanism depends, absolutely and without exception, on the saver being unable to leave. Therefore, the real question, the one that has been sitting underneath this whole thing since the beginning, was never who set the interest rate. The question is who built the walls, and the answer to that one has a date on it, and a place, and a photograph, and 730 delegates from 44 countries in a hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire in the summer of 1944, arguing about something they genuinely believed was the opposite of a trap. The Mount Washington Hotel sits at the foot of the Presidential Range in New Hampshire, a white wooden building with a red roof, and in 1944 it had been closed for 2 years and had to be hurriedly reopened and staffed to host the conference. The delegates arrived on the 1st of July and stayed until the 22nd, 730 of them from 44 nations, including a Soviet delegation, in the middle of a war that was not yet won. Normandy had happened 3 weeks earlier. Paris was still occupied. The purpose of the meeting was to design the financial system of a world that did not yet exist, and to design it specifically so that the 1930s could not happen again. That was the animating obsession of everyone in the room. Not debt, not inflation. The 1930s. Competitive devaluations, capital flight, trade collapse, mass unemployment, and the political consequence of mass unemployment, which every person in that hotel had just spent 5 years watching burn down half of Europe. The 2 men who mattered were John Maynard Keynes, leading the British delegation, and Harry Dexter White, the American, an economist at the United States Treasury, who was later credibly accused of passing information to Soviet intelligence, and who died of a heart attack in 1948, 3 days after testifying before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Keynes arrived at Bretton Woods already dying. He had suffered a serious heart attack in 1937 and never fully recovered. His wife Lydia, a former ballerina with the ballet's Russes, controlled his schedule with a ferocity that colleagues found comic, and that was in fact keeping him alive. During the conference, he suffered an episode severe enough that a rumour of his death briefly circulated in the hotel and reached the newspapers. He was 59 years old at Bretton Woods. He had 21 months to live. He was there to lose an argument. Keynes wanted an international clearing union, issuing a supranational reserve currency he proposed to call Bancor. The critical feature of his design was symmetry. In the system that had just destroyed the world, a country running a deficit was forced to adjust through deflation and unemployment and wage cuts, while a country running a surplus faced no pressure whatsoever. Keynes described this asymmetry precisely. Adjustment was compulsory for the debtor and voluntary for the creditor. His clearing union would have penalised persistent surpluses as well as persistent deficits, forcing creditor nations to either spend or revalue. In 1944, the largest creditor nation on Earth, by an enormous margin, was the United States, and the United States was hosting the conference, and Harry Dexter White was not interested. The Bancor died. The clearing union died. The system that emerged put the dollar at the centre, fixed to gold, with every other currency fixed to the dollar, and placed the entire burden of adjustment on deficit countries, exactly as before. But on one point, Keynes and White agreed completely, and it is the point that built the walls. Both men believed that free movement of capital across borders was incompatible with the world they were trying to construct. Their reasoning was not sinister, and it was not stupid. If money can leave a country instantly whenever it dislikes a domestic policy, then no government can run a domestic policy that money dislikes. Want full employment through low interest rates. Capital leaves for higher rates elsewhere. Currency collapses. Policy fails. Want a welfare state financed by taxing wealth. Wealth leaves. In a world of mobile capital, the electorate can vote for whatever it likes, and the bond market decides what it gets. Keynes wrote, in a draft plan dated the 11th of February 1942, that control of capital movements, both inward and outward, should be a permanent feature of the post-war system. Permanent, not emergency, not transitional. White, 2 months later, wrote that a good case could be made for a government having the power to control the flow of capital in and out. The two architects of the post-war financial order agreed that ordinary people's money should not be allowed to leave the country. They wrote it into the treaty. Article 6 of the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund, Section 3, states that members may exercise such controls as are necessary to regulate international capital movements. There is a limit attached, which is that these controls cannot be used to block payments for ordinary trade. That is the entire architecture in one sentence. Goods flow freely. Money does not. The articles entered into force on the 27th of December, 1945. Now, I want to be extremely careful here, because this is the point in the story where it becomes tempting to reach for a conclusion the evidence does not support, and where a large number of people who tell this story go badly wrong. Nobody at Bretton Woods was designing a mechanism to drain savers. That is not what they thought they were doing, and there is no document suggesting otherwise. Read Eric Helliner's History of the Period, States and the Re-emergence of Global Finance, or Ben Steele's account, The Battle of Bretton Woods, or Barry Eichengreen's Globalizing Capital, and what you find in all three is a consistent picture of people trying to build a shelter. They wanted governments to have room to pursue full employment without being overruled by capital flight. They wanted to prevent the beggar thy neighbour devaluations of the 1930s. They had watched democracies collapse into fascism under the pressure of unemployment, and they had concluded, not unreasonably, that a financial system which made full employment impossible was a system that produced dictatorships. They were building a room with thick walls to keep the storm out, and the disturbing thing about this mechanism, the thing that took me an embarrassingly long time to see clearly, is that a room with thick walls does not know which side of it you are on. The architecture that stops capital fleeing a country in a panic is the identical architecture that stops a saver escaping a negative real interest rate. There is no way to build one without building the other. They are the same wall. Which means the question of intent, the question I started this whole thing wanting answered, may be the wrong question entirely. It may not matter what they meant to build. That is not the only wall. Either capital controls kept your money in the country. Something else had to keep it in government bonds. That something was a stack of domestic regulations, each with its own respectable justification, and Reinhart and Sprancia catalogue about 6 of them. Caps on the interest rates banks were permitted to pay depositors, requirements that banks and pension funds and insurance companies hold specified quantities of government debt for prudential safety. Reserve requirements, direct government ownership of banks, which was standard across most of continental Europe, directed lending, and an unusually tight relationship between finance ministries and central banks. Take the first one, because the United States example is the clearest. Regulation Q, introduced under the Banking Act of 1933, prohibited banks from paying interest on demand deposits and capped the rate they could pay on savings and time deposits. The stated purpose was to stop banks competing for deposits by offering rates so high they had to make reckless loans to cover them, which was a real and observed cause of failures in the 1920s. Perfectly sensible on its face. Now run it forward 20 years. Inflation is running at 5 or 6%. The legal maximum a bank is allowed to pay you on your savings is somewhere around 3. Your money cannot go abroad because of Article 6. It cannot go into a higher paying deposit because there is not one, because the ceiling is national. It can go into equities if you are the kind of household that owns equities, which in the 1950s in the United States was a small minority and in Britain smaller still. Or it can sit in the account and lose. It bound harder than anyone expected, and when it bound you could watch it happen. Twice, in 1966 and again in 1969 and 1970, market interest rates in the United States rose above the Regulation Q ceilings, and money began walking out of the banking system. Depositors who could do arithmetic pulled their savings out of accounts paying the legal maximum and put them into Treasury bills paying more. Economists called this disintermediation, which is a bloodless word for a bank run in slow motion, conducted by people who have simply noticed they are being underpaid. Housing construction collapsed both times, because the savings and loan institutions that funded American mortgages were the ones losing the deposits. Notice what that proves. The ceiling was not a suggestion. It was a real constraint that real people tried to escape from, and the moment an escape route appeared, they took it in large enough numbers to break the mortgage market. Which raises the obvious question of why more people did not escape more often over the previous 30 years, and the answer is that for most of that period there was nowhere for an ordinary household to go. Treasury bills were sold in minimum denominations that put them out of reach of a family with a few $100s in savings. There were no retail funds pooling small deposits into money market instruments, because nobody had invented one. Somebody eventually did, and the story of who is one of the more revealing footnotes in this entire subject. In 1971, 2 men in New York named Bruce Bent and Henry Brown launched something they called the Reserve Fund. The idea was almost insultingly simple. Pool the savings of ordinary people into a fund large enough to buy the wholesale money market instruments that only institutions could access, and pass the yield back to the depositors. They were not trying to overthrow anything. They were trying to solve the specific problem that ordinary savers were legally prohibited from earning what their money was worth. That is the money market fund, and its invention is the moment the wall started to fail. Money poured out of regulated deposits into the new funds through the high inflation of the 1970s, and by the end of that decade, Regulation Q was no longer a ceiling on what banks paid so much as a ceiling on whether banks would have any deposits at all. Congress phased it out under the Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980, with the last of the rate ceilings gone by 1986. An entire pillar of the post-war architecture was dismantled, not because anybody decided it was unjust, but because two men in an office found a legal way around it and everybody used it. I find that clarifying because it tells you exactly what the walls were doing. They were not preventing a crime, they were preventing arithmetic from being visible. The instant an ordinary person could see on a statement that a different account paid 4 points more, the political sustainability of the ceiling collapsed within a decade. Every single one of those constraints was defended, correctly, on its own terms, and together they constitute a structure in which the ordinary saver has no exit. That is the machine. That is the whole machine. There is nothing else to find. A government that is the largest debtor in the country, an interest rate held below inflation, and a set of rules which mean the saver cannot leave. Assemble those three things, and wealth flows from households to the state, continuously, silently, at 3 to 4% of national output per year, with no legislation, no tax, no announcement, and no possibility of a public argument about it. Because there is nothing to argue about. It does not appear anywhere. And it does not require anyone to know what they are doing. I keep coming back to that, and I want to name it plainly because it is going to be the whole point of this by the end. Every component of this system was installed by someone who thought they were solving a different problem. Regulation Q was bank stability. Article 6 was exchange rate stability. Pension rules were retiree protection. The peg was the war. Not one of those people was thinking about liquidating the national debt through the savings accounts of their own citizens. The mechanism is an emergent property. It is what those pieces do when you put them in the same box, regardless of why each piece was put there. The correct analogy is a drainage system. Nobody in a city decides that water should go to the lowest point. The pipes were laid by different departments in different decades for different reasons. The water finds the route anyway, because water does not need instructions, and the route exists. Which brings up the thing that almost nobody understands about sovereign debt, and it is the most useful thing in this entire subject. Ask anyone how a country gets out from under an unpayable debt, and you will get one of two answers. Default, meaning it announces it will not pay, and creditors take the loss openly. Or hyperinflation, meaning the currency collapses, the debt becomes worthless, and the country ends up in Weimar with wheelbarrows. Those are the two images available in public consciousness, and they are both dramatic, and they are both visible, and they both produce a moment where somebody has to stand at a podium and say what is happening. Go and look at the historical record, the one Carmen, Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff assembled across 8 centuries and 66 countries for their book This Time is Different, and neither of those is the common case. They are the exceptional cases. They are what happens when the ordinary mechanism fails or is unavailable. The ordinary mechanism is slow erosion. Years of modestly negative real returns compounding in a closed financial system until the ratio has fallen and the problem has gone away and nobody can point to the moment it was solved because there was no moment. It does not produce wheelbarrows. It does not produce a podium. It produces a generation of people who feel, without being able to articulate why, that saving money no longer works the way their parents said it would. That is not a failure state. That is the system operating correctly. And it operated correctly in the United States and Britain and France and Italy and Japan for 35 years, with the exact results the arithmetic predicts. And then, for reasons that had nothing to do with anybody deciding it was unjust, it stopped. Abruptly, because one man in a suit walked into a room in Washington on a Saturday evening in October of 1979 and turned it off, and the cost of turning it off was so severe that no one has been willing to do it since. Before we get to the man who turned it off, I want to show you the thing working, because the numbers from Britain are cleaner than the American ones and considerably harder to explain away. The United Kingdom came out of the Second World War owing more, relative to the size of its economy, than any major nation in modern history. The Office for Budget Responsibility, which is the British government's own independent fiscal watchdog, has published a series going back 3 centuries, and in it the ratio of public sector net debt to gross domestic product in the financial year 1946-47 comes in close to 250%. I should flag a genuine source conflict here, because the OBRA itself has published a separate analysis putting the post-war peak at around 270%, and the difference comes down to which debt measure and which year you anchor on. The Bank of England's own long-run data set, compiled by Ryland Thomas and Nicholas Dimsdale under the title A Millennium of Macroeconomic Data, is the underlying source for most of these series. Take 250 as the conservative figure. It is still 2.5 times everything the country produced in a year. By the financial year 1991-92, that ratio was 24%. Now here is the detail from the OBRA's own analysis that I think is the single most clarifying fact in this entire subject, and I would ask you to hold it against everything you have ever been told about paying down national debt. Over the 30 years following 1946, the United Kingdom's national debt in cash terms did not fall. It rose, from around £27 billion to around £64 billion. The country borrowed more, not less. It ran deficits. It built the National Health Service and a nuclear deterrent and 1 million council houses, and it borrowed to do it. And the ratio collapsed anyway. Because the denominator was moving faster than the numerator, and the denominator is nominal gross domestic product, which is real output multiplied by the price level. Britain did not pay off its war debt. Britain outran it. And a large part of what did the outrunning was not production, it was prices. That is the entire trick, expressed in one sentence, and once you see it in the British numbers, you cannot unsee it anywhere else. You do not have to repay a debt if you can make the economy it is measured against get numerically larger, and you can make an economy numerically larger by making things cost more. And the only people who lose when things cost more are the people holding the claims that were denominated before the prices moved, which was, in 1947, almost everybody in Britain who had any savings at all. The Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Labour government elected in 1945 was Hugh Dalton, an economist by training, a man of the left who had studied under Keynes's teacher. Dalton pursued what was called a cheap money policy, an explicit attempt to drive the interest rate on government, borrowing down to 2.5% and hold it there, on the theory that cheap finance would fund reconstruction and full employment. The gilts issued under this policy were nicknamed Daltons. They were undated, meaning they had no maturity date, meaning the government never had to repay the principal at all. They paid 2.5% forever. The policy failed almost immediately in market terms. Investors would not absorb the volume at that price, and the gilts fell below their issue price within months. And Dalton was gone from the Treasury by November of 1947 after leaking budget details to a journalist on his way into the Commons chamber. But the bonds outlived him by an extraordinary margin. 2.5% undated Treasury stock was still in existence, still paying 2.5% into the 21st century. Britain finally redeemed the last of the undated gilts in 2015. Consider what happened to somebody who held one of those. They lent the government money in 1947 at 2.5%. British inflation over the following 3 decades included the 1950s, the 1960s, and then the 1970s, when retail price inflation in the United Kingdom peaked above 24% in 1975. A holder of 2.5% undated stock through that period did not lose some of their capital. In real terms, they lost essentially all of it. The bond kept paying, the payments became a rounding error. By the 1980s, the coupon on a Dalton was worth so little that the administrative cost of processing the payment was a meaningful fraction of the payment, and at no point was anything taken. At no point did the British government fail to honour a single obligation. The contract was performed exactly as written, in full, for 68 years. That is what a debt liquidation looks like when it works. It looks like nothing. Now, I promised you I would not oversell this, and there is a serious academic dispute about how much of the post-war debt decline should be attributed to this mechanism versus to ordinary growth and ordinary taxation, and you should know what the disagreement actually is, because most people who tell you this story do not tell you there is one. The sceptical position was set out most rigorously by Robert Hall and Thomas Sargent in a paper in the American economic journal Macroeconomics in 2011. Sargent won the Nobel Prize in Economics that same year. They decomposed the American debt-to-output ratio from 1945 to 1974 into its components, and found that the decline was driven by a combination of real economic growth, the negative real returns on the debt, and genuine primary surpluses, meaning years in which the government took in more tax revenue than it spent, excluding interest. Their emphasis is on the combination. America did in fact tax its citizens and pay some of this down. That is not nothing, and it should not be waved away. The strong position is Reinhart and Sprancia's 3 to 4% of gross domestic product per year, which we have already covered. And then in 2024, Acklin and Ball ran the counterfactual we started with. And the counterfactual is what breaks the deadlock, because it does not ask how much each factor contributed on average. It asks what would have happened without the distortions. And the answer, 74% instead of 23%, means that the growth story on its own gets you less than half the distance. The primary surpluses were real, and they contributed 17 points. The interest rate distortion contributed 28. The honest summary, and I have gone back and forth on how to phrase this, is that post-war debt reduction was overdetermined. Several things were happening at once, and all of them helped. But if you removed the negative real rates and kept everything else, the debt does not disappear. It stays high enough that the entire post-war political settlement, the welfare states, the health systems, the housing programs, becomes a much harder argument to win. Which means the thing that made the Golden Age fiscally possible was the thing that was quietly taking money out of the savings of the people living through it. I want to stop on that for a moment, because it is genuinely uncomfortable and I do not think it should be smoothed over. There is a version of this story where the villain is obvious and the injustice is clean. That version is not available. The money that came out of British and American savers in the 1950s did not go into a vault. It went into the operating costs of the post-war state. It funded the hospitals those savers used, and the schools their children attended, and the pensions they later collected. The transfer was from savers to the government, and the government spent it on the savers, unevenly, and on other people, and on aircraft carriers. If you want to argue that this was a rough but functional social contract, in which a generation paid for reconstruction through their savings rather than through visible taxation, you can make that argument seriously, and some economists do. I am not sure it is wrong. But notice the shape of it. Notice that it was a tax, levied at a rate nobody voted on a base nobody defined. Collected from people who were never informed at an amount they could not calculate, by a mechanism that appears in no budget document. Whatever you want to call that, you cannot call it consent, and you cannot call it accountable, because there is no office to which you could have complained. The Chancellor did not set your real interest rate. Nobody set your real interest rate. It was the residual of an inflation number and a policy rate that were determined separately by different institutions for different reasons. This is the part where people usually say, well, that is the past. Post-war exigency, extraordinary circumstances, a different world. And that is what everyone thought for about 40 years, because for about 40 years the machine was off. But it did not switch off because anyone found it unjust. It switched off because inflation got so far out of control in the 1970s that the mechanism started threatening the thing it was designed to protect, and one man decided to break it, and the price he paid for breaking it is the reason nobody has been willing to do it since. Paul Volcker was 6 feet 7 inches tall, smoked cheap cigars in an office where he was not supposed to, and wore suits that appeared to have been purchased at some point in the previous decade and never replaced. He had been at the Treasury during the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 and had watched the fixed exchange rate architecture come apart from the inside. Jimmy Carter appointed him chairman of the Federal Reserve in August of 1979, at a moment when American inflation was running above 11% and rising, and when the previous decade had thoroughly destroyed the public's belief that anyone in Washington could or would stop it. On Saturday the 6th of October, 1979, Volcker convened an unscheduled meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee and announced afterward, at an evening press conference, that the Federal Reserve was abandoning its practice of targeting interest rates and would instead target the quantity of bank reserves directly and would let the interest rate go wherever it had to go. That last clause is the whole thing. He was not announcing a rate, he was announcing that he was removing the ceiling. The effective federal funds rate went above 19% by June of 1981. Different sources put the peak at 19.1% or just under 20%, depending on whether you measure the effective rate, the target, or the daily high, and the discrepancy is not important. What is important is that the price of money in the United States roughly quadrupled in under 2 years. Real interest rates went sharply, brutally positive. For the first time since before the war, a person holding a savings account or a Treasury bond in America was being paid more than the rate at which prices were rising, by a wide margin. The machine did not slow down, it reversed. Wealth began flowing from debtors to creditors, which is to say from the government, and from anyone with a mortgage to anyone holding financial assets. The cost of that reversal was distributed exactly the way you would expect. The recession that began in 1981 was, until 2008, the worst downturn since the Great Depression. Unemployment in the United States peaked at 10.8% in November and December of 1982. That is roughly 12 million people out of work. Manufacturing in the industrial Midwest did not recover. The term Rust Belt entered common usage during this period, describing a landscape of closed plants that had been operating continuously since before the war. The protests were specific, and they were personal in a way that protests against monetary policy usually are not, because for once the causal chain was short enough for people to see it. Farmers drove tractors to Washington and blockaded the Federal Reserve building, because farming is a business run entirely on borrowed money, and a 20% interest rate on operating loans is a death sentence. Car dealers, whose customers finance almost every purchase, mailed the Federal Reserve the keys to unsold vehicles. Home builders mailed in lengths of lumber, sometimes with messages written on them, from projects that would never be built. Volcker kept some of the lumber in his office. He received death threats. At one point, an armed man got into the Federal Reserve building, carrying a sawn-off shotgun and a pistol, and took hostages, saying he wanted to speak to the board about interest rates. The board authorized a security detail for the chairman for the first time, and it worked. Inflation, which had peaked at 14.8% in March of 1980, was down to around 3.2% by 1983. The expectation of permanent inflation, which is the thing that actually makes inflation self-sustaining, broke. Volcker had demonstrated that the mechanism could be switched off, that a determined central bank with enough political cover could simply refuse to permit negative real returns. Here is what I want you to take from that, and it is not what the standard telling takes from it. The lesson institutions actually learned from 1979 to 1982 was not that inflation must be fought. That is the lesson written on the plaques. The lesson learned in practice was what it costs to fight it. 10.8% unemployment. A generation of industrial employment destroyed. A president who had appointed the man who did it losing his re-election in part because of it. Death threats and hostages and tractors. Every central banker and every finance minister for the next 40 years operated with that price tag in front of them. Not as a warning about inflation, as a warning about the cure. And that fact, sitting quietly in the institutional memory of every finance ministry in the developed world, is going to matter enormously when we get to 2021, because the question then was never whether officials understood what was happening. They understood perfectly. The question was whether anyone was willing to pay Volcker's price again. But something else happened in the same window, and it happened almost simultaneously in Britain and then across Europe, and it received a fraction of the attention. The walls came down. In October of 1979, the same month as Volcker's Saturday meeting, the new British government abolished exchange controls. The Exchange Control Act of 1947, which had governed how much money a British citizen could take out of the country, which had at various points limited the amount of currency you could carry on holiday, which had required Treasury permission to buy foreign assets, and which had been in continuous operation for 32 years, was simply switched off. Geoffrey Howe announced it in the budget. The staff of the Bank of England department that administered the controls, several hundred people, were reassigned or made redundant. Across the European community, the same dismantling happened over the following decade, culminating in the Capital Movements Directive of 1988, which required full liberalisation of capital flows between member states by the 1st of July 1990. Article 6 of the Bretton Woods Agreement was still on the books. It is still on the books today. Nobody repealed it. It was simply not used, which means that between roughly 1979 and 1990, the two conditions that make the mechanism work were both removed at once. Real rates went positive, and the walls that kept savers from leaving came down. For the first time since before the Second World War, an ordinary person in a developed country could earn a positive real return on cash, and if they did not like the terms on offer at home, could take their money somewhere else. 40 years of that, roughly 1980 to 2008, extending in a weakened form to 2020. Positive real rates most of the time. Free capital movement. The machine was off, and it was off for so long that it dropped out of the profession's active vocabulary entirely. Financial repression became a term you used about Argentina, or about China's banking system, or about India before liberalisation. It was something that happened elsewhere, in less developed places, run by less enlightened people. Ignazio Visco's figure is the one to hold here. Real interest rates in the advanced economies were negative in about half the years of the Repression era, and in less than 15% of the time since the early 1980s. So the middle class of the developed world spent 4 decades in the most saver-friendly monetary environment in modern history. And it did not feel like it. That is the fact that has to be explained. Because if this whole argument were as simple as negative real rates drain the middle class, then the era of high positive real rates should have been an era of middle class flourishing, and everyone knows perfectly well that it was not. The period from about 1980 onward is the period people are describing when they say things stopped working. It is the period of stagnant wages, of the first generation to do worse than their parents, of housing becoming unattainable, of the hollowing out of the industrial working and middle classes across the entire Western world. The Economic Policy Institute's number for the United States is the one most often cited. Between 1979 and 2019, net productivity grew by 59.7%, and the compensation of the typical worker grew by 15.8%. A gap of nearly 44 percentage points, opening steadily over 4 decades. I should tell you that this figure is contested, and the criticism is technically serious rather than merely political. Martin Feldstein, who was Reagan's chief economic advisor and a Harvard economist of considerable stature, argued in a paper in the Journal of Policy Modeling in 2008 that the gap is substantially a measurement artifact. The productivity series is deflated using the prices of what is produced. The wage series is deflated using the prices of what workers consume. Those two price indices diverged over this period, so part of the apparent gap is comparing two things measured in different units. He also pointed out that comparing wages to productivity omits non-wage compensation, principally employer-provided health insurance in the American case, which grew enormously. Correct for both, and the gap shrinks, in some estimates by more than half. The Economic Policy Institute has responded to all of this and continues to defend the measure. My reading, for what it is worth, is that the gap is real and smaller than the headline number, and that the direction is not seriously disputed by anyone. Something decoupled. The argument is about how much. Whatever the size, the experience was not ambiguous. Household debt to income ratios rose steadily across the developed world. The proportion of income required to buy a median house rose. The age at which people bought a first home rose. The proportion of household wealth held as financial assets, as opposed to housing, became increasingly concentrated at the top. So here is the shape of the thing that emerges, and it is not tidy. For 35 years after the war, the machine ran, savers were quietly drained, and the middle class had the best 3 decades in its history. Then for 40 years the machine was off, savers were well compensated, and the middle class was hollowed out. If you were building an argument that negative real interest rates are what destroyed the middle class, that pattern ought to end the argument on the spot. It is the single strongest objection to everything I have said so far. It is factually correct, and I am going to come back to it and deal with it properly, because it does not mean what it appears to mean, and the reason it does not is the most important thing in this entire subject. But first you need to see what happened when the machine came back on. Because it did come back on. Not in one country. Not in a crisis in some peripheral economy. In the United States, across the Eurozone, in the United Kingdom, and in Japan at the same time in a 2-year window, to a degree not seen since the 1970s. And it did it without a Bretton Woods, without an Article 6, without exchange controls, and without anyone announcing anything at all. Which raises the question that has been sitting underneath this whole story from the beginning, and which I still do not have a comfortable answer to. If the machine needed walls, and the walls came down in 1979, then how is it running now? The answer is that it does not need walls anymore. It needed walls in 1950. Because in 1950 there were places to go. There was a positive real rate available somewhere, in some other currency and some other bond market, and the walls existed to stop you reaching it. By 2020 there was nowhere to go, because every major bond market on Earth was doing the same thing at the same time, and a wall is unnecessary when the entire outside is identical to the inside. That is not a metaphor. Let me give it to you as data. Start with the United States, and start with the cleanest possible measurement, because there is an instrument that measures the real interest rate directly and removes all argument about which inflation index to use. Treasury inflation protected securities, usually called TIPS. The principle adjusts with consumer prices, so the yield quoted on a TIPS is a real yield by construction. It is the number with nothing to argue about. On the 21st of January, 2021, the United States Treasury auctioned a new 10-year TIPS. It cleared at a real yield of negative 0.987%, which was at that moment the lowest real yield on a 10-year Treasury security in the history of the instrument. 6 months later, on the 22nd of July, 2021, the Treasury auctioned another 10-year TIPS. It cleared at negative 1.016%, breaking the record set in January. Read that as what it is. Institutional investors at a public auction of United States government debt competitively bid for the privilege of lending the American government money for 10 years on terms that guaranteed, contractually and with no uncertainty whatsoever, that they would get back less purchasing power than they put in. And they bid it down. There were more buyers than paper. On some survey-based measures, the real 10-year Treasury yield reached around -2% at the trough. But I prefer the auction numbers because there is no modelling in them. That is not an estimate of the real rate. That is the price at which the debt actually sold, on a specific day, with the results published by the Treasury. Now Europe. The European Central Bank introduced a negative deposit facility rate on the 11th of June, 2014, at -0.1%. That was the first time a major central bank had charged commercial banks for holding reserves with it. It was described at the time as an emergency measure. It was cut further and further, reaching -0.5% by September of 2019, and it stayed negative until July of 2022. 8 years. A negative policy rate in the second largest currency area in the world for 8 consecutive years, 4 of which had nothing to do with a pandemic. At the peak of its asset purchase programs, the Eurosystem held securities equivalent to around 38% of Eurozone gross domestic product. Take a moment with that number. The central banking system of the Eurozone had acquired claims equal to more than a third of everything the Eurozone produces in a year. Nominal yields on German government bonds went below zero across most of the maturity curve, meaning a German pension fund that wanted the safest asset denominated in its own currency had to pay the German government for the service of holding its money. And Japan. Japan is where this stops being a policy and becomes a structure, and Japan is the part of this story that I think almost nobody in Europe or America has properly looked at, even though it is the closest thing we have to a controlled experiment. In September of 2016, the Bank of Japan introduced what it called yield curve control, not a target for the overnight rate. A target for the yield on the 10-year Japanese government bond set at 0%, with the bank committing to buy whatever quantity of bonds was necessary to keep it there. If that sounds familiar, it is, because it is precisely, structurally, almost line for line, the American peg of 1942, a central bank committing to buy unlimited quantities of government debt in order to hold a long-term yield at a chosen number. The Federal Reserve did it for 9 years, and it took a constitutional confrontation between the president and the central bank to end it. The Bank of Japan did it for 7.5 years, and it ended with a press release. The band around the target was widened repeatedly as pressure built. In July of 2018, in March of 2021, in December of 2022, when it was moved to plus or minus half a percentage point, again in July and October of 2023. And the whole framework was finally abandoned in March of 2024, when the Bank of Japan simultaneously ended the last negative policy rate in the world and raised its rate to a range of 0 to 0.1%. To sustain that, the Bank of Japan had to buy an amount of its own government's debt that has no historical parallel. According to the bank's own flow of funds accounts, its holdings of Japanese government bonds reached somewhere between 52 and 54% of the outstanding market, peaking at close to 53.9% around September of 2023. There is a definitional wrinkle worth noting, which is that if you include short-term Treasury bills in the denominator, the figure comes down to around 46% according to the Ministry of Finance, and some analysts quoting different measures have gone as high as 60%. Whichever number you take, the Central Bank of Japan owns roughly half of its own government's debt. That is a captive market. Not created by law. Not created by exchange controls or reserve requirements or a directive from the Finance Ministry. Created by the simple fact that one buyer with an unlimited balance sheet stood in the market for 7 years and took the paper off everyone else. The private saver in Japan was not forbidden from selling. There was simply no yield left to be had, because the yield had been bought. Now put the four of them side by side, because this is the claim in the title and it needs to survive verification rather than just sound good. In 2021 and 2022, real interest rates were negative in the United States, in the Eurozone, in the United Kingdom, and in Japan, simultaneously, not sequentially. Not roughly around the same time, overlapping for a period of well over a year in the four largest developed economy bond markets on the planet, which between them account for the overwhelming majority of the world's investable safe assets. And then, the inflation came, and the real rates went from mildly negative to something that had not been seen in the lifetime of most people watching. Consumer price inflation in the United States peaked at 9.1% in June of 2022, the highest reading since 1981. Euro area harmonized inflation peaked at 10.6% in October of 2022, which is the highest figure in the history of the single currency. British consumer price inflation peaked at 11.1%, also in October of 2022, a 41-year high. And in January of 2023, Japanese inflation reached 4.3% on the headline measure and 4.2% on the core measure that excludes fresh food, which was Japan's highest core reading since September of 1981, against policy rates that were, in every one of those four cases, still far below those figures at the moment they peaked. The gap between what your money earned and what your money bought in 2022 in the four largest developed bond markets was somewhere between 6 and 9 percentage points depending on where you lived. Reinhart and Spranzia's figure for the entire post-war repression era was 3 to 4% of gross domestic product a year, and that figure was considered large enough to have liquidated the greatest debt overhang in history. 2022 was substantially worse than any single year of it. And then, in the autumn of that year, something happened in London that I think is the single most revealing event in this entire story, because it is the one occasion on which the machine was briefly forced to operate in public. On the 23rd of September 2022, the British government announced a package of unfunded tax cuts. The gilt market's reaction was violent. Yields on long-dated British government bonds rose faster over the following days than at any point in the modern history of the instrument. Now, a rising yield is supposed to be a good thing for savers. It means the government is finally paying a decent real return. It is the correction. It is the thing that had been withheld for 13 years arriving all at once. It nearly destroyed the British pension system in 4 days. The reason is a structure called liability-driven investment, which had grown enormous over the preceding decade for a reason that comes directly out of everything we have been discussing. British defined benefit pension schemes have obligations stretching decades into the future. When the yield on safe assets is near zero, the present value of those future obligations becomes enormous, and the schemes appear catastrophically underfunded. So they used derivatives to manufacture the interest rate exposure they could no longer buy in the bond market directly, posting collateral against those positions. 13 years of suppressed yields had pushed the retirement savings of millions of British workers into a leveraged bet on yields staying suppressed. When yields spiked, the collateral calls arrived. Funds sold gilts to raise cash. The selling pushed yields higher. That triggered more collateral calls. Bank of England officials later described the dynamic in terms that do not usually appear in central bank communications, and on the 28th of September the bank announced emergency purchases of long-dated gilts, explicitly to prevent what it judged to be a material risk to financial stability. Read what that actually was. A central bank in the middle of the fastest tightening cycle in 40 years, publicly committed to raising rates in order to fight inflation, was forced to start buying government bonds again to stop yields from rising in order to prevent the collapse of the pension funds that had been driven into leverage by the previous decade of the same policy. The Chancellor was gone within 3 weeks. The Prime Minister was gone within 6. Nobody described any of this as financial repression. It was reported correctly as a political crisis and a bond market accident. But strip out the personalities and look at the constraint that was revealed, because the constraint is the point. It was demonstrated, in public, over 5 days, that the financial system of a major developed economy could not absorb a rapid return to positive real yields without something structural breaking. That is not a claim about anyone's intentions. It is an observation about the range of available outcomes. If real rates cannot rise quickly without breaking pension funds, and cannot stay negative without draining savers, then the space in which policy can actually operate has become extremely narrow, and every point inside it involves somebody losing. The British case is the clearest, because it happened fast enough to see. But there is nothing uniquely British about it. Now I want to be careful, because there are 2 honest objections here, and they deserve to be stated properly rather than gestured at. The first is that this was a shock, not a policy. A pandemic closed the world's factories, supply chains failed, and then Russia invaded Ukraine and European energy prices went vertical. Nobody chose that. Central banks were not holding rates down in order to erode savings. They were holding them down because they had spent a decade unable to generate enough inflation, and they judged, wrongly as it turned out, that the price increases of 2021 were transitory. It was a forecasting error made in public by people who published their reasoning and were subsequently very publicly wrong about it. That objection is largely correct, and I accept it. The intent was not there. The second objection is that central banks did eventually respond, and hard. The Federal Reserve raised rates faster in 2022 than at any point since Volcker. The European Central Bank went from negative 0.5% to 4% in 14 months. This was not a repression regime. It was a lagged response to a mismeasured shock. Also largely correct. And here is why neither objection touches the argument, and this is the pivot of the whole thing. The mechanism does not require intent. It never has. Nothing in Reinhart and Spranzia's 3 to 4% per year depends on anyone in the 1950s wanting to liquidate debt through savers. The transfer is a consequence of an arithmetic relationship between 2 numbers. It occurs when the nominal rate is below the inflation rate. It does not check why. So the correct question is not whether anybody meant it. The correct question is what the balance sheets look like afterward. And on that, there is no ambiguity at all, because the institutions that benefited have published the numbers themselves. The International Monetary Fund reports global public debt as a share of world output. In 2020, at the height of the pandemic response, it stood at 100%. By 2022, it was 92%. The single-year fall in 2021 was the largest such drop in decades. The fund's own explanation attributes it to strong real growth, to inflation surprises, and to the withdrawal of fiscal support. Inflation surprises. That is the institutional phrasing for what happens when prices rise faster than the people who lent you money expected when they set the price of the loan. The most careful public quantification I have found comes from a group of World Bank economists, Ihan Kosei, Sergio Kuralat, Franziska Onsorge, and Naotaka Sugawara, in work circulated through Brookings in 2022. Their finding, and I am paraphrasing their arithmetic rather than their prose, is that over the 2 years from 2020 to 2022, inflation reduced the debt-to-output ratio of the advanced economies by almost 6 percentage points, while economic growth had about half that impact. For emerging markets and developing economies, excluding China, Russia, and Ukraine, the combined effect exceeded 4 percentage points, of which almost 3 came from inflation alone. And they add a note that I keep returning to. They describe their own estimates as lower bounds. 6 percentage points of advanced economy output in 2 years off the liabilities of governments, attributable to prices rising faster than the interest being paid on the debt. Somebody was holding the other side of that. I want to give you the counter-argument properly here, because there is a serious paper that says this effect should be much smaller, and it is a good paper. Jens Hilscher, Alon Raviv and Ricardo Reis published a study in the Review of Financial Studies in March of 2022 called Inflating Away the Public Debt. An empirical assessment. Reis is at the London School of Economics and is one of the more careful people working on this. Their argument is that inflation on its own cannot do much to the American fiscal position, because American debt is concentrated at short maturities. Short debt reprices quickly. If you have to roll your borrowing every 2 years, inflation only gets one bite before the lenders demand compensation. Their central estimate was that a bondholder loss above 3.7% of output had less than 1% probability. That looks like it demolishes the argument. It does not, and the reason is in their own paper. Because they are explicit that inflation combined with financial repression, meaning inflation alongside sustained low real rates on the rolled over debt, produces a substantially larger effect. Their finding is not that the debt cannot be inflated away. Their finding is that inflation alone cannot do it. You need the second ingredient. You need the rates to stay down while the prices go up, which is exactly what happened between 2020 and 2023, and which is exactly what the World Bank numbers measure. The two papers are not in conflict. Hilscher, Raviv and Reis describe the mechanism failing when it runs on one leg. The World Bank measured it running on both. There is a framework for this, and it is worth naming, because it is the language the profession actually uses when it discusses this among itself. In 2019, Olivier Blanchard, formerly chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, gave his presidential address to the American Economic Association under the title Public Debt and Low Interest Rates, subsequently published in the American Economic Review. The argument concerns the relationship between the safe real interest rate, conventionally written as R, and the growth rate of the economy, written as G. When R is below G, a government can roll its debt forever without ever running a surplus. The ratio falls on its own. The debt services itself. The entire post-war debt liquidation was a period of R below G. The years from 2020 to 2023 were an extreme instance of R below G, achieved by driving R deeply negative. Blanchard's address was widely reported as good news. It was framed as evidence that governments have more fiscal room than the deficit hawks claim, which it does. What was very much less discussed is the identity of the counterparty. A safe real interest rate below the growth rate means the holders of safe assets are being compensated at less than the rate at which the economy is expanding, which means their share of it is shrinking continuously for as long as the condition holds. There is no version of R below G in which savers do not lose ground. It is the same statement, read from the other end. Now the wages. Japan is where this is measured most precisely, because Japanese labour statistics are unusually good, and because the run was long enough to become a national news story. Real wages in Japan, according to the monthly labour survey published by the Ministry of Health, Labour and Welfare, fell year on year for 26 consecutive months, from April of 2022 through May of 2024. That is the longest continuous decline in Japanese real wages on record, surpassing the previous record of 23 months set during the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009. The streak ended in June of 2024, when real wages rose 1.1%, the first increase in 27 months, and the increase was driven substantially by summer bonus payments rather than base pay. More than 2 years. Every month, the Japanese workers' pay bought less than it had bought in the same month of the previous year. 26 times in a row. I want to put a person in that number because Japan is the one country where you can trace the whole arc through a single lifetime. Consider somebody born in Japan in 1950. They enter the workforce around 1972. At the tail end of the miracle, into a system built on an assumption so widely shared that it barely needed stating, which was that you work for one company, you save relentlessly, you put the savings in the postal savings system or a bank deposit, and the accumulated cash carries you through retirement. Japanese household savings rates in the 1970s ran above 20% of disposable income, among the highest ever recorded in a developed economy. That behaviour was not irrational, and it was not cultural mysticism. It was the correct response to the incentives in front of them. The asset bubble peaks at the end of 1989. Our saver is 39. Over the following decade, the Nikkei loses most of its value, and urban land prices fall for more than a decade straight, and anyone who had put their savings into the assets everyone was telling them to buy is destroyed. Our saver, having stayed in cash, looks prudent. Then the interest rate goes to zero and stays there. The Bank of Japan cut its policy rate effectively to zero by 1999. It has been at or near zero, and for a period below zero, for the overwhelming majority of the 25 years since. Our saver holds cash through their 50s and 60s and into their 70s, earning approximately nothing, in an economy with approximately no inflation, which for a long time meant they were not obviously losing either. The purchasing power was preserved. Nothing grew. It was a kind of stasis, and an entire generation planned around it. And then, at the age of 72, after 50 years of doing exactly what the system asked of them, inflation arrives at 4.3%, and real wages fall for 26 consecutive months, and the Bank of Japan owns more than half the government bond market, and the yen loses roughly a third of its value against the dollar in 3 years, which for a country importing almost all of its energy and much of its food means the prices in the shop move regardless of what the domestic economy is doing. 50 years of the most disciplined household saving behaviour in the developed world, and the terms changed in the last decade of their life, and there was no announcement, and there is no mechanism by which they could have known, and there is nothing they could have done about it at 72 that they should have done at 40. That is not a Japanese story. Japan is just further along the curve than everyone else, which is why it is worth watching. The same demographic structure, the same debt ratio trajectory, and the same policy responses are visible across most of the developed world, running maybe 15 or 20 years behind. Britain's version ran roughly 18 consecutive months through April of 2023. The Resolution Foundation and the Trades Union Congress have both characterised the wider period as the longest squeeze on British real pay in more than 2 centuries. The United States and the Eurozone both had roughly 2 years of negative year-on-year real wage growth, though neither publishes a consecutive month streak figure of the kind Japan does, so the comparison is not exact. 4 major economies, overlapping the same 2 years. Now the deposits, and this is the part that made me genuinely angry when I worked through it, which I mention because I have tried to keep the temperature down through most of this and I do not think I can here. When central banks finally raised rates in 2022, the higher rate was passed to borrowers immediately. Mortgage costs went up on the schedule contractually specified. Credit card rates repriced. Corporate borrowing repriced. That is the transmission mechanism working as designed. The higher rate was not passed to depositors. The European Central Bank documented this in its own financial stability review in May of 2023. Between June of 2022 and March of 2023, the European Central Bank raised its policy rate by more than 300 basis points. Over that same period, the rate paid on overnight household deposits in the euro area rose by around 25 basis points, 300 in. 25 out. In the United States, the measure economists use is called the deposit beta, which is the fraction of a policy rate increase that gets passed to depositors. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York's research on this puts interest-bearing deposit betas at around 38% by the fourth quarter of 2022, and that figure covers interest-bearing accounts, which excludes the enormous stock of household money sitting in current accounts paying nothing at all. Meanwhile, the reserves that commercial banks hold at the central bank were being remunerated at the full policy rate. Paul DeGrauw and UMAG have estimated that in 2023, the Eurosystem was paying something in the region of 140 to 146 billion euros a year in interest to commercial banks on around 3.6 trillion euros of reserves, and that the equivalent payments in the United Kingdom reached something like 1.5% of British output by May of 2024. I should say clearly that the framing of those payments as a subsidy is contested and traces largely to DeGrauw and G's own work. The European Central Bank's position is that remunerating reserves at the policy rate is not a gift but a technical necessity, because if banks could earn more elsewhere, the policy rate would not transmit at all. That is a real argument, and it is probably right as a matter of mechanics. But hold the mechanics next to the outcome and tell me what you see. The central bank pays the commercial bank the full rate on the money. The commercial bank pays the depositor a small fraction of the rate on the same money. The depositor is simultaneously experiencing consumer price inflation at 8, 9, 10%. The spread between what the money earned and what the money would have earned if the rate had been passed through went to the bank, and the spread between what the money earned and what it needed to earn to stand still went to whoever owed money, which above all is the government. Run it on a specific number, because abstraction is where this stops being felt. 100,000 euros or dollars or pounds sitting in an ordinary bank account in January of 2020. Cumulative consumer price inflation across the following 5 years in the United States, the Euro area and the United Kingdom ran to somewhere above 20% in each case, with Britain higher. Interest paid on ordinary deposits over that period was, for most of it, close to nothing and never close to matching inflation. By the end of 2024, that 100,000 buys roughly what 80,000 bought when you put it in. The statement still says 100,000. It may say slightly more. 20,000 went somewhere. It was not stolen. There was no crime. Every institution behaved lawfully, and most of them behaved defensively. Your bank did not break its contract. Your central bank was pursuing a mandate given to it by your parliament. Your government did not levy a tax. And the debt ratio of your government fell by almost 6 percentage points. Now I have to deal with the objection, because if I do not, the whole thing collapses, and it should. The objection is this. The era of maximum financial repression, 1945 to about 1973, is the single best period the industrial middle class has ever had, not arguably, measurably, by every metric anyone has ever proposed. The Centre on Budget and Policy Priorities has run the American family income data for that stretch, and the finding is not subtle. Real family income roughly doubled between the late 1940s and the early 1970s at the 95th percentile, at the median, and at the 20th percentile. The whole distribution moved at roughly the same rate. Pew's analysis of the same period puts average annual family income growth above 2.5% in every single income quintile, from 1947 to 1973, and finds that the ratio of top quintile to bottom quintile income fell to its modern low of about 7.25 to 1 in 1969. The Piketty and Saez Top Income Share Series and the World Inequality Database that grew out of it show the share of income going to the top 1% falling through this period to levels that have never been reached since. So the argument I have been building says that negative real interest rates drain the middle class, and the period of the deepest, longest, most systematic negative real interest rates in modern history is the period in which the middle class was created, enriched, housed, and made more equal than at any point before or since. That is not a minor inconsistency. That is the argument being run over. I sat with this for a long time, and the resolution is not a dodge. And it is not a matter of saying, well, other things were also happening. The resolution is that I had the mechanism half wrong, and correcting it makes the picture considerably darker rather than more comfortable. Financial repression is not a transfer from the middle class to the government. That is the sloppy version, and it is what almost everyone who tells this story says, including. For the first half of this, a negative real interest rate is a transfer from creditors to debtors. That is all it is. It has no view about class, or income, or fairness, or who deserves what. It moves purchasing power from anyone who is owed money to anyone who owes money, in proportion to the size of the position, and it does this with complete indifference to who those people are. So the question of whether it helps or destroys the middle class has exactly one determinant. Is the middle class, on net, a creditor or a debtor? In 1955, the American or British middle-class household was a debtor, and a heavily leveraged one. It had a mortgage that was large relative to its income and its savings. It had a modest deposit account. It owned essentially no equities. Its single largest financial position, by an enormous margin, was a fixed-rate long-term liability. Home ownership in the United States went from around 44% in 1940 to around 62% by 1960. Britain saw the same movement with council house building and then council house purchase. A negative real interest rate hits that household on two sides. It loses a small amount on its deposits, and it gains enormously on its mortgage, because inflation shrinks the real value of the debt while the payment stays fixed in cash terms. A 30-year mortgage taken out in 1955 in a country running 4% inflation is substantially repaid by prices alone by 1970. Net effect on that household, unambiguously and by a wide margin, positive second factor. That household's wages were rising in real terms, continuously, because the labour market was tight, and because roughly a third of the American workforce, and rather more of the British, was covered by collective bargaining agreements that repriced annually against the cost of living. Inflation eroded the value of its savings, and its pay went up to compensate, and the compensation channel worked. Third factor, the government took the transfer and spent it on things that came back to that household. Housing programs, national health services, expanded schooling, university systems, motorways, rural electrification. The money went from the savings account into the state, and then back out in the form of a hospital the household used. That is a circuit, not a drain. Fourth factor, and this is the one that matters most for where we are now. The escape hatch was cheap. If you wanted to get out of cash and into a real asset in 1955, the real asset was a house. And the house cost roughly 2 to 3 times a single median income, and required a deposit an ordinary family could actually assemble. The exit was open, and it was affordable, and an entire generation walked through it. Now run the same 4 factors for 2022. Is the middle-class household a net debtor? Increasingly, no. A rising share of it rents, holds no mortgage at all, and holds what savings it has in cash. The European Central Bank's Household Finance and Consumption Survey and the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances both show the same distributional shape. Deposits are the dominant asset for households in the middle and lower parts of the wealth distribution, and for the elderly. Equities and business assets are overwhelmingly concentrated in the top decile. Mortgage debt is concentrated among the young and the upper middle, which means the transfer no longer runs from the top to the middle. It runs from the cash, holding old, and the asset less young to the leveraged, and the asset rich, which is a substantially different group of people than it was in 1955. Is the wage channel working? No, that is the entire content of the productivity and pay divergence, whatever the true magnitude turns out to be after you correct for the deflator problem. Union coverage in the American private sector is now around 6%. The mechanism that automatically repriced middle-class income against inflation in 1955 does not exist. So inflation erodes savings, and the compensating pay rise arrives late, partially or not at all. That is what 26 consecutive months of falling Japanese real wages actually measures. It is the compensation channel failing in real time. Is the transfer being spent on things that come back? Much less so. A far larger proportion of the fiscal capacity being freed up goes to servicing existing obligations and to transfers to older cohorts. The circuit is longer, and for a working-age household it is much less obvious that the money returns at all. And is the escape hatch open? This is the one that finishes it. By 2020, when the mechanism restarted, asset prices had already had 12 years of post-financial crisis monetary support behind them. House price to income ratios in most developed countries were at or near historic highs before the inflation began. Which means the door that the 1950s middle class walked through, the conversion of cash into a leveraged real asset, had been priced out of reach of a large part of the population by the previous decade of the same policy. So the answer to the objection is not that the mechanism was benign then and malignant now. The mechanism is identical. It is the same arithmetic, running on the same instrument, with the same indifference. What changed is which side of it you are standing on, and what determines which side you are standing on is whether you own a leveraged claim on a real asset. In 1955, almost everybody in the middle could get one. In 2022, a great many could not. The machine did not turn against the middle class. The middle class moved. I want to be honest that this does not settle every question, and there are 3 further objections that I think are strong and that I am not going to pretend to have demolished. The first is that the simultaneity across countries reflects a common shock rather than a common playbook. A pandemic hit everywhere, and an energy crisis hit most places, and independent central banks facing the same shock made the same forecasting error at the same time. There is no coordination required to explain this, and I have not shown any. That is fair. I would only add that the absence of coordination is not reassuring. A mechanism that produces identical outcomes in 4 independent jurisdictions without anyone coordinating is more robust than one that requires a meeting. The second is that the middle-class squeeze has other and possibly larger causes. Housing supply constraints, above all, which are a matter of planning, law and land use rather than monetary policy, and which in most countries have a much clearer causal chain to unaffordability. Healthcare and higher education cost inflation, which in the American case dwarf almost everything else. Globalization and the exposure of manufacturing labour to international competition. Technological change. Market concentration. Every one of those is real, and every one of them is doing work in the same direction. I am not claiming monetary mechanics is the whole story, and anyone who does is selling you something. The third is the strongest, and I have already conceded it. Negative real rates are a rough deal for savers and a good deal for mortgage holders, and there are tens of millions of middle-class mortgage holders. The net distributional effect across the whole middle class is genuinely ambiguous, and depends on the composition of the group you draw a line around. What I would say, and this is a position rather than a finding, is that the ambiguity is the thing that makes it politically indestructible. Because a policy that visibly hurt a majority would be stopped. A policy that hurts a large minority intensely helps another large minority quietly and is invisible to everyone in both groups because it never appears as a transaction, cannot be stopped, because there is no constituency capable of forming around a loss that does not show up on any statement anywhere. You cannot organise a protest against a subtraction that nobody can see, and that is where this stops being an economic story. Japan's gross government debt is above 250% of its annual output. It has been above 200% for well over a decade. There is no serious proposal anywhere in Japanese politics to repay it, because there is no arithmetic under which it can be repaid, and everyone involved knows this and nobody says it. 250% is roughly where Britain was in 1946. Britain got out of that. We have spent this whole time on how it took 30 years of holding real returns below zero inside a closed financial system, and it worked, and the people it worked on were never told it was happening to them. Now look at what happened to that number everywhere else after 2020. Global public debt went from 100% of world output to 92%, and the fall was attributed by the International Monetary Fund to growth, to inflation surprises, and to the withdrawal of emergency support. The advanced economies got almost 6 percentage points of relief from inflation alone in 2 years, on the World Bank's estimate, which its authors describe as a lower bound. And yet the level in most developed countries remains at or near the highest peacetime figure ever recorded. So the machine ran hard for 2 years, took 6 points off, and the pile is still historically enormous. Which means the arithmetic that governed 1946 governs now, and it produces the same 3 options it has always produced. Option 1. Repay it honestly. Run sustained primary surpluses, which means taxing more than you spend, excluding interest, for decades. Britain and America partially did this after the war, and it contributed 17 percentage points in the American case, and it was politically survivable then because of a specific and unrepeatable set of circumstances involving a recent existential war. A demographic structure with far more workers than retirees, and a public accustomed to wartime sacrifice. Try to run that in a developed democracy in the 2020s, with the current age structure and the current pension and healthcare commitments, and you will not survive the first budget. Option 2. Default. Announce that you will not pay. This has been done by developed countries within living memory, and the consequences are severe and immediate and highly visible, and no finance minister in a reserve currency economy is going to be the one who does it. Option 3 is the one that has no announcement attached, and here is the thing that I keep circling and that I think is the actual centre of this. There is no fourth option. Growth would be the fourth option, and growth is what everybody says, and growth is what everybody has been promising for 15 years, and the productivity numbers in every major developed economy since 2008 say that growth at the required rate is not arriving. Acklin and Ball's counterfactual measured precisely this. Even in the greatest growth period in the history of the industrialized world, growth alone got you from 106% to 74%. It did not get you to 23%. If the post-war boom was not enough on its own, nothing available now is going to be enough on its own. Therefore, option 3 functions as the residual rather than as a selection. It is what happens by default when the other options are unavailable, and it happens whether or not anyone selects it, because it does not require selection. It requires only that nominal rates stay below inflation, and nominal rates staying below inflation is what happens when a central bank is reluctant to cause a recession. Which brings us back to Volcker, and to the price tag, and to why I said it would matter. Every central banker alive knows exactly what it costs to hold real rates firmly positive against a large debt stock and a weak economy. 10.8% unemployment. Tractors on Constitution Avenue. Lumber in the mail. An armed man in the lobby. A president who loses. That cost has been measured exactly once, in the only instance where anyone has ever done it, and it has been sitting in the institutional memory of every finance ministry in the developed world for 43 years. The lesson of Volcker was never that inflation can be beaten. The lesson was what beating it requires you to be willing to do to your own population, and how few people are willing to do it twice. Nobody has to conspire. Nobody has to plan. Every individual official, at every individual decision point, facing a choice between a recession now and a slightly negative real rate for a while longer, will choose the slightly negative real rate, because the recession is visible and attributable and will end their career. And the negative real rate is invisible and unattributable and will not. Make that choice a few thousand times across 4 continents over a decade by people who have never met each other and who are each acting entirely reasonably within their own mandate, and you get a machine. That is the third thing I asked you to hold, and it is the last one. This is going to happen again, not because anyone will decide it should, because the conditions that produce it are permanent now, and the mechanism does not require a decision. It rederives itself. It assembles out of individually defensible choices made by people who are not thinking about it, in the same way a river does not decide to flow downhill. And there is one more feature of it that I did not expect to find, and that I have been trying to think my way out of for weeks. The mechanism is protected by democracy. Count the constituencies. Mortgage holders benefit from negative real rates, and there are tens of millions of them, and they vote. Homeowners benefit, because the asset price channel supports their principal store of wealth. And homeowners are a majority in most developed countries, and they vote at higher rates than renters. Pensioners on index-linked state benefits are substantially protected, because the indexation moves with prices, and pensioners vote at the highest rate of any group. Anyone holding equities benefits. The government benefits, and the government is the entity organising the election. Now count the losers. People holding significant cash savings relative to their debts. Young people trying to accumulate a deposit. Workers whose pay does not reprice against inflation. Holders of long-dated fixed nominal claims, meaning private pensions and life insurance and annuities, most of whom have no idea what their pension fund actually holds and would not be able to observe the loss if they did. The losers are dispersed, unorganised, largely unaware, and in most cases would not be able to identify what happened to them even if you sat them down and explained it, because there is no document showing it and no date on which it occurred. That is not a policy failure. A policy failure implies a policy. This is a stable equilibrium in which the beneficiaries are numerous and identifiable and politically active, the losses are invisible, and no institution has either the mandate or the incentive to name what is happening. It will not be voted out, because you cannot vote against arithmetic. It will not be reformed, because there is nothing to reform. There is no statute. There is no agency. There is no rate schedule and no collection department, and no line in any budget document in any country describing the several % of national output that moves every year from savers to debtors. And it will not be reported, because it does not produce an event. Journalism requires something to have happened on a particular day. This is a rate of change. It has no news hook, ever, in any year, and that is why you have watched 500 stories about the deficit and none at all about the thing that is actually resolving it. John Maynard Keynes died on Easter Sunday, the 21st of April, 1946, at Tilton, his farmhouse in Sussex, of a heart attack at the age of 62. He had come back from Savannah 6 weeks earlier from the inaugural meeting of the institutions he had helped design, exhausted and by most accounts bitterly disappointed by how much of his vision had been discarded. The Articles of Agreement had entered into force 4 months before he died. The International Monetary Fund did not begin operations until the following year, which means Keynes never saw the system work. He died before the machinery he had argued for was switched on, and he died more than a quarter of a century before anyone measured what it had done. He spent the last 4 years of his life fighting for the principle that capital should not be permitted to move freely across borders. He believed that if money could flee a country whenever it disliked a government's policy, then no government could pursue full employment, and no electorate could get what it voted for, and the whole democratic project would end up subordinate to a bond market. He wrote that this control should be permanent. He was not wrong about any of it. Every argument he made about why capital mobility constrains democratic policy has been vindicated repeatedly since 1979. He built a wall to keep the bond market from overruling the electorate. The wall worked. It held. And what it held still, for 35 years, in 9 countries, was the savings of the electorate, while 3 to 4% of national output a year moved out of them and onto the balance sheet of the state. I do not think that is irony. Exactly, irony is too light a word. It is closer to a demonstration of something about institutions that I would rather not be true, which is that the function of a structure has almost nothing to do with the intention behind it, and that a wall built to keep something out will keep something else in, and nobody has to notice this for it to be the case. Marriner Eccles won his fight. That is the part I keep coming back to. He was demoted by a president. He stayed in the building anyway. He spent 3 years arguing that the Federal Reserve had become an instrument for repaying government debt out of the pockets of bondholders. He was proved right. The accord was signed on the 4th of March 1951. The peg was broken. The institution he had rebuilt got its independence back. And he retired that summer, having accomplished exactly what he set out to accomplish. And the debt kept melting for 23 more years. He identified the mechanism, named it, fought it, defeated the visible instance of it, and it made no difference to the outcome. Because the visible instance was never the mechanism, it was just the part with a signature on it. That is the thing I did not understand when I started this, and that I understand now in a way I find genuinely uncomfortable. I went looking for the room where the decision was made, and I found several rooms. The Mount Washington Hotel in July of 1944, the Federal Reserve Boardroom in April of 1942, the Treasury office where the accord was drafted, Volcker's Saturday meeting in October of 1979. Every one of those rooms is documented, minuted, photographed, and populated by people whose names and motives and arguments are all a matter of public record, and not one of them contains the decision, because the decision does not exist. There is no document in which any government at any point in any of these countries decided to fund itself by holding real returns below zero on the savings of its own population. That document has never been written, because it has never been necessary. The outcome does not require a decision. It requires only that a government owe a great deal of money, that an interest rate be set below the rate at which prices are rising, and that this continue. Richard Cantillon understood the structure of it in 1730, and he understood it because he had been standing on the insertion point with his hands out, and I think he understood something else as well, something he did not write down, which is that the person who stands closest to where the money enters is not a villain and is not clever, and did not earn the position. He was just there. Proximity was the only variable then too. They pulled a body out of his house on Albemarle Street in May of 1734, with the head gone. A cook was tried and acquitted. A post-mortem suggested the man was dead before the fire started. His biographer thinks he may have staged the whole thing and sailed to Suriname under another name. There is a grave at St. Pancras that says otherwise. 290 years later, nobody has established what happened, nobody was ever punished, and the only thing anyone can say with certainty is that a very large amount of money changed hands, and that the man who explained how it worked is not available for questioning. That is the shape of this entire subject, and it always has been. The transfer is documented, the mechanism is published, the arithmetic is not in dispute, and there is no one to ask. So here is where it leaves you. You have a bank account. Right now, as you are listening to this, there is a number in it. That number is not going to go down. Whatever happens in the next 10 years, the number will not go down. It may go up slightly. Your bank will not fail, in all likelihood. Your government will not default, in all likelihood. Nobody is going to take anything from you, and nothing is going to appear on any statement that you could point to and say, there, that is where it went. And a portion of what that number can buy is going to move onto the balance sheet of an institution that owes more money than it can repay. Because that is the only remaining mechanism by which the debt of the developed world can be resolved, and because the people who will implement it will not know they are implementing it, and because when it is finished, nobody will be able to identify a day on which it happened. The 1946 generation went through this. 85 million Americans bought war bonds, and the bonds were honoured, and by the time they matured, a large part of what had been lent was simply not there anymore, and those people went to their graves believing they had been paid. They had been paid. Every penny. That is the part that is difficult to hold in your head at the same time as the other part. They were not robbed. There was no robbery. There was an arithmetic relationship between two numbers, maintained for 35 years by institutions acting within their mandates, and at the end of it the largest debt in the history of the world had gone, and the people it had gone through never found out. The machine is running again. It has been running since 2020. It ran hard for 2 years and took almost 6 percentage points off the advanced economies, and the people who published that number described it as a lower bound. It will run again when it is needed, and it will be needed, and it does not require permission, and there is nobody to withhold it from. You will not be told when it starts. You were not told the last time. There will be no announcement, because there is nothing to announce, because nothing will have happened. Check your balance in 10 years. The number will be there. It is what the number will buy that will have moved.